The year is 2016. The team is the Fantastic Five. This is the Motion Picture Science Shootout. This cinematic joyride is 15 minutes long, filled with quantitative data and qualitative analysis, objective conclusions and subjective observations. This is BS territory. 4 cameras will be tested: the FS700, the FS7, the F5, and Kodak 500T Vision 3 film, because film is not dead.
The 3 cameras we decided to test are the Sony F5, FS700, and FS7. Each came with their own accessories and recording options. We chose these cameras because most of them are accessible by the RIT sofa cage, or not too expensive to rent outward. They all have the same sensor, yet have slightly differences about them. We recorded them in different ways, with the F5 using the Sony RAW recorder, with the FS7 and FS700 using an Odyssey 7Q. For the F5, we used an AXS R5 recorder, which allowed us to tap into the 16-bit linear RAW 4K output of the Sony F5. For both the Sony FS700 and FS7, we recorded onto the Convergent Designs Odyssey 7Q in a RAW DNG format.
We weren't able to secure the additional camera accessories we needed for the 700 and the 7 to connect to the Sony recorder, but we still wanted access to shoot RAW so we can compare the cameras on as even a playing field as possible. With the Sony recorder, both the 7 and the 700 could record a 12-bit linearly encoded RAW signal. Convergent Design, the manufacturer of the 7Q recorder, claimed to be able to match this capability.
It's a little difficult to fully understand the workflow from shooting to recording to color grading.
It was important that all 3 cameras be shot in a RAW format for the purposes of analytical comparison. A RAW recording is as minimally processed as the imagery can be. The digital code values are linearly related to the amount of light that hit the image sensor. This is why when RAW recordings are made, they are done so using much higher bit depth encoding than the 8 bits of the typical display.
The workflow for these 3 cameras was different, depending if you were using the Sony RAW recorder or the Odyssey 7Q. When ingesting the footage using DaVinci Resolve, the file formats are read in different ways. The MXF files from the F5 are read as Sony RAW, where the .dng files from the Odyssey 7Q are read as Blackmagic RAW.
Resolve doesn't allow for Sony lookup table application unless you process it first as a Blackmagic Design camera. It's not entirely clear why this is. When we bring the raw F5 footage into Resolve, you are allowed to treat it as a Sony camera. We haven't been able to figure out why.
This was an issue and required multiple steps in order to get the Blackmagic RAW into a Sony RAW color space. With the F5 files, it was super easy for us to just drop them into Resolve, choose our color space, our white balance, and our exposure.
While the 7Q recorder did work with both the FS700 and the FS7, allowing us to capture raw images, we experienced a significant problem with the resultant FS7 footage. Nearly every clip from the FS7 appeared brightly magenta when imported into Resolve or any other post-production program. The few clips that are not affected don't seem to have any correlation with any settings or shooting conditions. Our best guess as to why this happens is that the communication of metadata from the FS7 to the 7Q recorder is incomplete or breaks down somewhere. Altering the raw files, white balance, metadata can fix the problem before further color correction is done, but not in all cases.
We created a scene with 8 stops of overexposure and 7 stops under normal exposure. We also compared film. We start with the windows. The curtains on the windows had 8 stops over the normal exposure. As you can see, the F5 had recoverable detail in the curtain, when the 7 and the 700 did not. As we pan to the right, you'll see a dark room. This room has darkly lit objects, ranging all the way to 7 stops of underexposure. The F5 and the FS700 were both able to recover information from this scene, albeit noisy. The FS700 was sharper in the dark scene, but the F5 was still recoverable. In the overexposed footage, you can see high-frequency detail in the mohawk of this duck on the FS700 and the F5, but the FS700 was noisier.
The F5 performs much better than the other 2 digital cameras in this high dynamic range scene, because it records a 16-bit raw image, whereas the FS700 and the FS7 can only record 12-bit raw sequences, even with the Sony recorder. In this scene, we're going to be testing how each of the cameras do in a simple composite. You'll notice in the scene that there's a vase with some flowers and also some fringe that will be blowing in the wind to help create an interesting problem for the compositor to have to deal with. When completing the composite, I used the Nuke software, and I decided upon the prime matte key after trying a couple of different keyers. The F5 did the best with the fringe out of the 3 cameras. Contrastly, the FS700 did the worst with the fringe, leaving more of a green outline. The FS7 did pretty good with the fringe, but the F5 keyed better than the FS7. The F5 did well with the flowers, but had some trouble cutting out the stems and the vase. The FS700 did well with the flowers and vase, but it had some edging artifacts. The FS7 did well with the flowers, but a leaf was cut off. When I was working with the FS7 footage, the key automatically grabbed the blues along with the greens, so I had to spend a little bit more time keying out the foreground blue elements that I wanted to keep. This probably has something to do a little bit with the magenta effect that is occurring in all of the other shots. Overall, for a simple composite, the F5 was the easiest to use, but given enough time, all of the cameras were on a pretty even playing field for our composite test.
It was upsettingly cold out there. All of the batteries kept dying on our cameras, on the film camera, for the recorder, for my phone, for the speaker we were using. Yeah, it was cold as shit.
For the next scene, we head to the beach. The main purpose of this scene is really just to test the aesthetic quality of each of these cameras. For this scene, we also included film, 35mm film, for the comparison. As you can see, for the F5 and compared to the FS700, they actually look almost identical. The F5 has a little bit of a green cast to it. In this scene, the FS7 actually looks good. For all the other scenes, we pretty much bash on the FS7 and the magenta or green artifacts that show up in the scene.
An interesting fact about taking the magenta out from this scene is that it actually resulted in the best image out of the 3 cameras according to our findings. So this is the only scene that was exposed flat enough that there was no issues with the magenta in the shadows or in the highlights.
This scene was partially designed to compare the aesthetic qualities of film and the Sony digital cameras. As the film look is all the rage these days, we compared film to each camera to see which was most comparable to the film look. After looking at the film compared to the FS7, the FS700, and the F5, we have subjectively decided that the softness of the F5 provides the closest look to film. While we were at the beach, we also filmed a close-up of a face for a qualitative test of sharpness.
For the close-up, it's the first time that the FS7 actually recorded in the right color. That's very interesting because we didn't change anything with the settings. When looking at all the cameras next to one another, we found that the F5 had a way too clean of an image, especially in the background, and it looked very digital and gross. Also for the close-up, we had the 35mm film. Now, we're not exactly pleased with our film scan, so we wish that we could have gone back through and done a little bit more meticulous grading on it to really help accentuate where the film is supposed to shine. The objective of this skin tone scene was to show multiple skin tones within the same frame and also with different colored backgrounds, and just to really accentuate the ability of each camera to show multiple skin tones at one time. The magenta cast resulted in a huge issue for the neutrals, being that the FS7 was almost impossible to get back. Using image wipe, we were able to try to match the images as close as possible to one another, because it's really important in order to discern the minor differences in the skin tones. Crimson scene, it's logical to almost completely discern the FS7 because the footage was just so bizarre. The F5 had a green tint in the skin tones as well as in the tapestry that we didn't see in any of the other cameras. However, the FS700 was a little bit more muted and had that blue shadow noise that we talked about before. For the flamingo scene, a consequence of removing all the magenta cast in the FS7 footage resulted in a much higher saturation in the footage compared to the other two cameras. While the F5 had more realistic color reproduction, it wasn't as aesthetically pleasing as the FS700, which was more subdued and still had blue shadows, but was softer and easier on the eyes. One interesting thing to note is that the tablecloth changes drastically between the cameras, while the skin tones seem to be a little bit more in tune. This is probably because of the magenta cast in the FS7.
The purpose of this scene was to see how the cameras perform in low light. We shot a dimly lit scene to evaluate where the noise was and how bad it is. We also underexposed by 2 stops to see how much we could recover and testing the camera's latitude. We start with the F5, which we decided looks the best in the low light scene. The FS7 had this ugly green banding. The 700 had blue noise, but the detail was still recoverable.
Color correcting the low light scene was quite a challenge just because the fact that there wasn't much information to begin with. With the normally balanced exposure, the F5 was almost crystal clean right off the bat. The FS700 had the colors perfectly, but it was a little bit noisier, whereas the FS7 had that magenta cast again, and trying to get it out resulted in quite a lot of issues. When we underexposed the scene by 2 stops and I was told to grade it up to test the latitude of the cameras, there are halos around the candles, especially in the FS7 footage, that are neon green, resulting in a completely unusable image. The FS700 has a similar issue, but it's just with the blue grain all around. It's a very noisy image, and I wouldn't suggest using it at all. Whereas the F5 was able to come back, and with some noise reduction and fixing, I bet you could get a good image out of the F5, even if you're 2 stops underexposed.
The F5 was the only one that we could actually recover a good-looking image. The FS7 and the FS700, they were just too damn noisy.
The 2016 shootout was considered by the large MPS junior class as one of the most time-consuming events of the first half of the 21st century. It lingered through 5 grueling months and consumed many long nights. In the MPS store, powerful debates over image quality destroyed the whiteboard and shattered any hopes and dreams of sleep. The storm of opinions on camera decisions erased the MPS store and its 5 inhabitants from the map. Although there were no survivors, a message was sent out and carried by the storm. Look at that. A message has arrived.
After working with all the different cameras as the colorist, I feel like the F5 gives you a very standard look, and you can push it anywhere you want to creatively, while the FS700 gives you an instantly aesthetically pleasing look, and the FS7 with all of the magenta issues is almost useless.
The really odd thing with the F5 is that everything appears a lot softer than the other 2 cameras, and for that amount of money and for that high-end camera to give softer images than the FS700, we have no understanding of why that's happening. With the FS700, what's really frustrating is that you don't get anywhere near the dynamic range of the F5, even though all 3 cameras are supposed to deliver the same photometric number of stops. If you're not pursuing a raw workflow, I think that the FS7 might make a good documentary camera just based on the ergonomics.
Overall for the beach scene, all the cameras actually look pretty good. And that kind of shows that there is not really a significance in spending the extra money for the F5 when the other cameras can kind of produce equally pleasing imagery for kind of this type of normal scene.
The FS700 is surprisingly versatile and reliable and delivers pretty good image quality. Unless you're shooting a movie that requires you to use a raw workflow, I can't see why one wouldn't benefit from sticking with the FS700. The F5 is definitely better if you are shooting in low light or you want the freedom to compensate later. Just based on the complexity, I think the FS700 beats the other two.